This incredible checkmate comes from the dangerous Stafford Gambit. White actually wins the black queen, but still gets checkmated. Let's rewind and see how this trap works. After a few normal opening moves, we quickly reach this position where white plays d3, trying to keep the center solid, but black develops the bishop to c5 and immediately targets the weak f2 square near the king. White calmly continues with b2, and now black plays a very strange-looking move, h5, which secretly prepares a kingside attack. White responds with bg5, pinning the knight and thinking the position is comfortable. But now the surprising move. Next 4 appears on the board, and suddenly the position becomes very tactical. At this moment, many players notice that the black queen is hanging on d8, so they greedily capture it with bxd8, thinking they have just won the game. But this is exactly the trap. Black immediately sacrifices the bishop with bxf2 check, forcing the white king to move forward to e2. Now, the king is exposed in the center, and black calmly brings the other bishop into the attack, delivering bg4 checkmate. The white king is completely trapped, proving that even though white captured the queen, the attack was already unstoppable. Right after that fishing pole nightmare, here's another classic that punishes greed, the Blackburne Shilling Gambit. Let's rewind and watch it happen. After a few normal developing moves, we reach this position where black suddenly jumps the knight to d4, attacking the bishop and creating pressure in the center. At first it doesn't look dangerous, and many players notice the pawn on e5 and immediately capture it with next 5, believing they have just won a free pawn. But this is exactly the mistake black is waiting for. The queen suddenly appears on g5, creating 2 threats at the same time. The knight on e5 is under attack, and the pawn on g2 near the white king is also hanging. White often tries to counterattack, instead of defending, and jumps the knight to f7 with check, thinking they are attacking the rook and creating complications. However, black calmly captures on g2 with the queen, attacking the rook on h1 and opening dangerous lines toward the king. If white tries to save the rook by playing rf1, the queen simply captures the pawn on e4 with check, suddenly dragging the white king into the fight. Now pay attention to white's 2 common replies. If white tries to block the check by slipping the queen between the kings, black's knight immediately jumps in and captures that queen, and the whole position collapses because material and the king's safety are gone. But if white instead desperately blocks with a bishop, that bishop move walks straight into a mating net, the knight and other pieces coordinate and deliver the decisive check that ends in mate. So what looked like a free pawn at the start actually becomes a quick disaster for white. After seeing that brutal Blackburne Shilling Gambit, let's look at another sneaky attacking idea known as the fishing pole trap, and the name actually describes the idea perfectly, because black is literally throwing bait and waiting for white to bite. After a few normal opening moves, the black knight suddenly jumps to g4, stepping right into white's territory and tempting the pawn on h3 to capture it. Most players immediately play hxg for thinking they have just won a free knight, but that is exactly what black wants. The pawn from h5 now captures back on g4, opening the entire h-file directly toward the white king. At first this still doesn't look very dangerous, so white usually continues developing with a calm move like h2. But now the real attack begins as the black queen slides to h4, aiming straight at the king's side. Now either he takes the pawn by queen or knight. The checkmate is unavoidable. Now let's look at a very tricky weapon against the move d4, the England Gambit, which can lead to a surprisingly fast checkmate if white is not careful. The game begins with d4, and black immediately plays e5, sacrificing a pawn to open the center and create quick attacking chances. White usually accepts the pawn with x5, and now black develops the knight to c6, putting pressure on that pawn. After nf3, black plays qe7, pinning the pawn on e5 to the king. White continues developing with bf4, but now black brings the queen to b4 with check, forcing the bishop to block on d2. At this moment, black grabs the pawn on b2 with qxb2, attacking the rook and creating serious threats on the long diagonal. White tries to defend by playing bc3, but now black calmly develops with bb4, increasing the pressure on the center and the king. White attempts to block everything with qd2, but this is where the trap is fully revealed. Black captures on c3 with bxc3, forcing the queen to recapture with qxc3, and now the final move appears on the board. The black queen slides all the way to c1, delivering checkmate. The white king is completely trapped, proving that in the England Gambit, one careless sequence can end the game in just a few moves. And finally, we arrive at one of the most beautiful traps in chess history, known as Le Gall's mate, a famous tactical pattern where white sacrifices the queen and still delivers checkmate. The game begins with a few normal developing moves until black pins the knight on f3 with the bishop, making it look like the knight cannot move because the queen behind it would be lost. White now plays h3, attacking the bishop, and black calmly retreats to h5, keeping the pin on the knight and believing the pressure is still there. But this is where the brilliant idea appears. White suddenly plays next 5, capturing the pawn in the center and apparently leaving the queen hanging. Black usually cannot resist this opportunity and captures the queen with bxd1, believing they have just won the game. However, this was the entire idea. White immediately sacrifices the bishop on f7 with check, forcing the king to move forward to e7. Now the black king is stuck in the center of the board with no safe squares left, and white delivers the final move in d5 checkmate. The knight, supported by the bishop and other pieces, controls every escape square, and the king has nowhere to run.